Okay, class, chapter 16, small businesses and franchises. In this chapter and the next couple of chapters, we're going to be dealing with the business forms that you can make when you have a business. Okay, so when choosing the form of business that you want to operate in, these are some of the considerations. The ease of creation. How difficult is it to create the type of business you want to operate? What's your liability going to be? What are your tax considerations? What is your need for capital, that is money, to operate your business? So all forms of business are going to have some similarities in terms of what they need or what they require. Okay, if we're going to talk about sole proprietors, which is a business owned by one person. If you're a sole proprietorship and you're using your own name, like Howard Sokol, then you don't need to do much of anything. But if you're going to use a name like Howard Sokol, Best Plumber in Atlanta, then you have to register your business name, sometimes referred to as a fictitious name. Okay, we'll talk about more of that in a minute. You may have to get an occupational license, and you may have to get a business license. You may have to register for state tax if you're going to charge sales, if you are selling something that requires a sales tax. You may have to meet certain health and environmental permits, some zoning and building codes, and some import and export regulations. You're going to want to protect your intellectual property, such as trademarks. We talked about that in an earlier chapter. Trade secrets. You want to make sure that your trade secrets are protected. You may have to do this by contract with your employees. They may be required to sign contracts that they will not divulge secrets of your business. Also, you may want to have non-complete clauses, which we talked about in an earlier chapter. Okay, let me go back a minute. Business name registration, I want to talk about that a little bit more. In Georgia, you have to register what's called your trade name or your fictitious name with the Superior Court in the county where you operate your business, which is kind of unusual. In most states, you register with your Secretary of State. So again, if you're going to operate Acme Plumbing, because that does not reflect your owner's name, you have to register that fictitious name. That's not only true of sole proprietors, but true of any business that's using a name other than their actual name. Okay, so a sole proprietorship is the simplest form of business. The owner is the business. It's the most prevalent form of business. That is, if you add up all the businesses, it has the most numbers, but it's one of the lowest, if not the lowest amount in terms of total capital involved. Okay. So it's defined as an unincorporated business owned by one person, a business managed and owned by one person. It's governed exclusively by state law and local laws, however, subject to federal taxation. There's no requirements in order to form a sole proprietorship in a state, although there may be certain licensing requirements. Okay, so this is probably the most important slide you're going to see on each form of business. It lists the advantages and disadvantages of doing business in that format. Okay, so I want to point out a couple of things here. One of the things I want to point out is that sometimes something is listed both as an advantage and a disadvantage. We'll get to that in a minute, but just note that. Okay, so what are the advantages of operating as a sole proprietorship? Full management authority. That means that you as the owner make all the decisions. You have all the authority. If you want to hire somebody, fire somebody, buy something, sell something, it's all your decision. There's almost no formalities. The only formality would be perhaps getting, if you're using a fictitious name, and you probably need to have an EIN, an Employee Identification Number, from the Social Security Administration. It's basically a Social Security number for businesses. So the ease of formation, it's easy to form. You basically don't do much of anything. That relates also to the cost of organization, which is low. Not very many costs involved. And no double taxation. Okay, we're going to be talking about that and comparing it to corporations that do have double taxation. So in a sole proprietorship, you pay your taxes just as an individual. On your 1040 form, there is a line towards the bottom of the first page which is for business income, and it says Form C. So there is a special form that you fill out called Form C, which shows your income in your business, your expenses, and your net income. Your net income is carried over to your 1040 form on that line, and that's how you're taxed. Corporations pay a corporate income tax, and then when the profits are passed on to shareholders, they're going to pay tax on those dividends. They're actually going to pay taxes on the dividends, as well as if they sell the stock and they make a profit off it, they're going to be paying a capital gains tax. Okay, some of the disadvantages of operating a business as a sole proprietorship. Unlimited liability. As the owner of the business, you are liable. And you're liable for your agents, any employees that you have. We talked about that in Chapter 19. That's why it's imperative, if you're going to operate as a sole proprietor, that you have sufficient liability insurance to cover you in case of a mistake or negligence or something of that sort. Lack of business continuity. When you die or when you retire, the business is over. You might be able to sell it to somebody else, but your business ends as far as you are concerned. No diversity in management. So this is the flip side of full management authority. Remember I mentioned earlier that you can have complete management authority, but as a positive or an advantage, but a disadvantage is you don't have anybody to help you. Nobody to help you make decisions. Nobody to take some responsibility. There's a difficulty in transferring your proprietary interest. You have to be able to sell it. It may not be something that somebody wants to buy. And how do you raise capital as a sole proprietor? You either put the money in yourself or you borrow it. You're limited. You can't sell shares of stock, and even your borrowing is going to be limited to some extent. Okay, so as I said, there's no formalities. Little has to be done. You have to file a certificate of assumed name, trade name, or fictitious name in Georgia in the county where the business is located. You apply for a tax identification number, an EIN. If you're going to sell goods, you have to have a sales tax permit, and you have to turn in your collection of sales tax on a quarterly basis. Licenses. Good time to talk about licenses. There are two types of licenses that you might have to have as a business. There's a plain business license which is issued simply for tax purposes. Almost every business has to have one. They're not real expensive. You don't have to meet any qualifications other than being a business to get that license. The other is a professional or a trade type of license. That type of license is issued for regulatory purposes. What I mean by that is that the business has to meet certain eligibility requirements in order to have that license and in order to work in that field. So for example, cosmetologists, people who do hair or other cosmetology matters, have to have a license. And to get that license, they have to pass a test to show that they're competent to do so. Lawyers have to have a license from the state. You have to pass the bar exam. You have to have a law degree, etc. Those are professional and trade licenses. You will have to register any pertinent trademarks, copyrights, or patents if you want to protect your intellectual property. Okay, so we're going to stop there and pick up in part 2 of chapter 16.